Hello, I'm Steve Hone, CEO of Data Center Alliance, and welcome to the latest DCA briefing session. Over the last 8 months, we've continued to support our members during the COVID crises, and since March, we've had a steady flow of legally related questions, which I'm delighted to say we have Conexus Law here today to assist us with fielding. This briefing will be broken down into 3 sessions. The first session will be with Ed Cooke, who'll be talking about relationship contracting. We'll then move on to Ian Timlin, who will be talking about dispute resolution and the valuable part that mediation plays. And finally, to Marilyn Hayward-Mills, who will be talking about employment law and staff wellbeing. So I'd like to start with Ed Cooke. I've known Ed for many years now, and he's the founder of Conexus Law. So Ed, welcome. Perhaps you'd like to start by just explaining a little bit more about Conexus Law.
Sure, thanks, Steve. Well, first of all, I suppose that the 3 of us, we're really delighted to be here. We really value a long-standing relationship with the DCA, and we know the important work that you do for the sector. You're right. So I've been working in the data center and technology infrastructure sector for about 15 years now, and I felt that so much was happening in the sector that it kind of merited its own focus and its own specialist law firm, actually. So we launched Conexus Law about a year ago. And it's been a bit of an odd year, as you might imagine. But despite that, we've managed to grow our team from a team of just 2 to a team of 12 people now, drawing together a number of lawyers who are experienced and inquisitive and really interested in the technology infrastructure sector. So in addition to Ian and Marilyn, who will introduce themselves a bit later on, we're delighted to welcome a whole host of other lawyers to our team, so including Emma Cordiner, who's joined the team. She's a real estate lawyer with a decade of experience negotiating data center leases and customer contracts, property finance, that kind of thing. We're also joined by Gavin Johnson. He's got particular expertise in build tech, so the use of technology in the construction industry. We've got Phil Brown in the UK and Sumit Chakravorty in the US. They're both experts on software licensing, data privacy, GDPR, that kind of thing. So Conexus Law works across 4 sectors: the built environment, the technology infrastructure, digital business, and emerging technologies. And for us, data centers sit within that kind of core technology infrastructure sector. And over the past year, we've been working on some really exciting projects in that sector. So we've been working in Europe and the UK, Nordics, India, Japan, and the US on a number of projects ranging from kind of 3 kilowatt projects to over 100 megawatt projects. And we've also concluded about 30 customer contracts this year. So we're working with people doing some really innovative things in the industry as well. So it's exciting. Yeah.
Thank you, Ed. This session is related to relationship contracting. So Ed, it's not a topic I'm familiar with, so it would be helpful if you could maybe explain a little bit more about relationship contracting and how it's valuable especially during this current pandemic.
Yeah, sure. I think really that you can't really get away from discussing COVID-19, can we? But I think really that has exposed the real importance of relationships within the data center sector, and I think overcoming the immediate issue of COVID-19, unfortunately, it looks as though the whole world is going to be thrown into a global recession. So those relationships will become much more important. So the question really was about a kind of shifting of focus from a transactional arrangement between parties to a contract to more of a relationship, a kind of more overarching relationship approach. So, I mean, I think that the data center sector is really well placed to weather the storm of a global recession and of COVID-19. I mean, I don't need to tell you and your members that we've become incredibly reliant upon technology infrastructure, people working from home and all of that. So, that kind of has just added to an underlying trend that we've seen in terms of investment in global infrastructure. But it's also important to recognise that the data center sector is actually a pretty small community of people. So a lot of my clients who are building or operating data centers, they find there's a very limited number of suppliers in each jurisdiction who've got the necessary experience and capability to do the job. And it's true to say that some of those suppliers might not weather the storm of COVID-19 and any recession quite as well. There have been a number of notable new entrants into the kind of developer, operator, investor level of the data center sector, but the supply chain still remains very constrained. And as it goes, as the data center sector matures, I think we'll find that there's some consolidation, and it certainly feels to me as though the names of suppliers are becoming even smaller. There's consolidation in the market, and that's driving a kind of shrinking of the market, if you like. So with that all in mind, the relationships between the parties to a particular project become absolutely critical. And we kind of see that in a non-legal context, if you like. So suppliers will have customer account management. So all the data center operators will have customer account management processes in place for all their customers. That's often designed to support a kind of sales function, really. And then some of the biggest purchasers will have supplier management systems, which are usually kind of an adjunct to their procurement teams. But the legal contracts that tie together particularly construction projects, often still very transactional in outlook. Each transaction, each project is usually viewed as a separate thing from a legal perspective. And as a consequence, there's not very much legal documentation that kind of talks to the relationship overall. So trying to bolster the relationship and seeing how the contractual infrastructure can support a deepening of the relationship between the various parties involved in a project, and kind of have that overspill into a whole program of projects. And I think that's really important. So relational contracting is all about adding a level of structure and discipline to the relationships, highlighting certain principles that are key and critical to the success of a kind of overarching relationship between providers.
Thank you, Ed. Could I just ask about maybe some of the issues that arise as a result of relationship contracting?
They're quite different to the transactional type of contracts. So they really are focused in on that relationship, kind of a partnership really between different suppliers. So a relational contract would deal with things like communication. So I've kind of got 8 or 9 principles really, but communication is one of the key ones. So does the customer share its upcoming pipeline of work so that the supplier is able to kind of gear up and is able to make an investment into the relationship, knowing what the outcome of that might be? How freely do the parties speak to one another about any issues that they might encounter on a particular project, and how do they take that forward and think about how they can change things for future projects? So it's kind of defining a framework for communication between the parties. That's one of the principles. Risk allocation is another key principle of a relational contract. So our risks are appropriately apportioned to the party that's most capable of managing them. Ensuring risk allocation isn't a disincentive to collaborative behaviour, and how do the parties work together on things like shared risks? So often stuff like COVID-19 was a bit of a shared risk in many contracts. So how do the parties work together on that? So risk allocation is another critical thing, but thinking about how you can allocate risks in a way that supports the relationship. Problem solving is another key principle of relationship contracting. So thinking about how do you deal with future issues, and particularly how do you deal with change? Having a no blame culture, so focusing first on the relationship and that kind of whole kind of ethos of we're in this together, but not doing that at the sacrifice of having clarity over what the roles are and what each party's responsibilities are. So there's a fine balance there. Another key principle is around joint working. So thinking about what are the benefits and the rationale for joint working? How can we almost have a charter really of how we work together? Many relational contracts will include a gain and pain share mechanism, so that actually if there's an upside, then all parties will share in that, and if there's a downside, then they all suffer that. having mutual objectives, aligning goals and objectives. Some level of performance management, so thinking about, well, what is it that's critical to success in this relationship? How do we manage that? How do we incentivize that? And how do we measure it? How do we reward it as well? And then oftentimes the key element really to relational contracting is this whole concept of continuous improvement. So how do we take the experiences that we had on one project or one part of one project and roll that into the relationship and the program of projects moving forwards? And the idea behind relational contracting really is that as a consequence of adhering to all of these principles and addressing all these principles, trust starts to develop between the parties. And that really is at the heart of any relationship.
Finally, Ed, if I could ask, hindsight being a wonderful thing, if parties had relational contracts in place prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, would they have been able to be better prepared or be in a better position to weather the storm?
Well, I firmly believe they will be, yes, and indeed better able to weather that storm of a global recession, if that's what we're headed towards. I mean, if I think about what happened under traditional kind of transactional contracts, I mean, as soon as lockdown started to happen across the globe, as lawyers, we were, and I suspect many other firms of lawyers were absolutely inundated with calls about force majeure mechanisms and all of that kind of stuff. And the dust is starting to settle on that now, although, you know, many countries are suffering a second wave, and so that might change things. There might be a renewed focus on force majeure clauses, and we're really only now understanding the time and money impacts of COVID-19. So I think we may well see some further claims, but I would say actually even under a transactional basis, because of the relationships within the industry on the whole, I'd say that I've witnessed some pretty pragmatic and cooperative behaviour from most parties, but there have of course been exceptions. But I do think that if we look at relational contracts and we really address the relationship rather than the transaction, then the parties will weather that storm much better. So I think that will result in better outcomes for all parties. So, for example, if you address the principle of communication, if there was a better understanding of particularly things like the length of the supply chain. So COVID-19 has demonstrated how reliant we are on actually pretty long and pretty global supply chains. And to an end user, those supply chains are totally opaque normally. So the small company who's supplying a widget in a generator or something like that can, if they get locked down in a country where there are strict lockdown rules brought in, then that can seriously affect the deliverability of a whole project, a 100 megawatt data center project. And we did see that happening. Well, relational contracting would, if you were in that kind of mode and you were looking more at the relationship than at the transaction, you would already have an understanding. Every party in that relationship would already have an understanding of what the supply chain looks like, because we would have adhered to that principle of communication and transparency. So in the relationship contract, in the relational contract, it would talk about that and the need to be open. So I think, yeah, anecdotal evidence has certainly suggested that parties who have strong relationships and who have addressed their relationship within a contractual model, they certainly do, weather the storm better. We'll be publishing some toolkits on relational contracting on our website at conexuslaw.com. So people can find out some more information there, and of course I'm always happy to have a chat with people about it. But those are the kinds of key benefits I see from relational contracting, and I do think, particularly within a relatively small industry like the data center sector, it's going to become really important.
Many would say that we're coming into a recession. Some even say a depression that we've not seen since the 1930s. For me, I'm wondering where previous recessions have been, the catalyst has been the housing market, whether this one might be driven by the commercial sector due to the reduction in the need for retail and office space as more work from home. I was wondering what your views are on that.
Well, certainly some real estate sectors have been already quite severely impacted. And yes, you're right. So retail is one of those sectors that's been very badly impacted. Offices is another one. And then it's all of the kind of follow-on trades, so follow-on businesses rather. So if you think about Canary Wharf, think of all of the sandwich shops and bars and restaurants and what have you that have sprung up in Canary Wharf to service the people who are in the offices, and then of course they're not in the offices anymore. So that's a real problem. I do think we're going to see a change in landlords' approach to things like rent. So you might, some of the viewers of this webinar might have seen a fact sheet that's on our website at the moment, which is all about turnover rents. Now, turnover rents were something that were in favour about 20 years ago, and then kind of went out of favour. They were used by some shopping centres, but not widely used in the real estate sector. But now I think we might see a form of kind of turnover leases coming back in again, where the rent, there is a kind of fixed element of rent as you would see it now, but it's reduced, and then there is a further element of rent which is basically linked to the tenant's turnover. And we'll also see it's not just about kind of taking the hit, I guess. It's not just about sharing the downside. We will start to see landlords, I think we already probably are seeing, landlords taking a proactive stance to kind of helping their tenant businesses do better, and kind of get through COVID-19 and whatever else might befall them in a better way. So that's interesting, I think. So they're actually taking a more active kind of mentoring role within the tenant businesses, particularly where those tenants are small businesses.
Thank you, Ed. Some really great advice and guidance there. This ends this session. The next session will start shortly, when we will be speaking to Ian Timlin, talking about dispute resolution and the value of mediation. So feel free to tune in.